Last thing I want to get to is hockey related. I know. Hockey? They're still playing. I don't know if you knew this or not, but they're still playing hockey right now. They're still playing in the NHL right now, friends. I was watching it late last night and the night before. And then the NHL playoffs are something that I truly, truly miss in this city. And the NHL playoffs also happen to be something that Rick Tocchet has only ever reached twice in 9 years as a head coach. Why do I bring that up? Because it certainly feels like Rick Tocchet is going to be the next coach of the Philadelphia Flyers. I'm not reporting it. I am merely pointing out that there is a growing feeling among people around the organization and from a few people that I have had good enough interactions with in the past that have passed along some little nuggets in the past, that Tocchet is probably at the top of the list for your team, your town, your Philadelphia Flyers. Now, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? I don't know. 2 playoff appearances in 9 years. One of them, if I remember correctly, was like a weird bubble team. It was like a weird Arizona bubble team. So I don't know if we really count that. But they made the playoffs. Now, in fairness, hard to evaluate a coach who coached out in Arizona. Hard to evaluate a Vancouver team that imploded this year and that had 2 of their best players in Elias Pettersson and JT Miller kind of take a spat public, and that there had been some rumors that there may have been a scuffle of sorts behind the scenes. It's kind of hard to evaluate that as well. Tocchet was well-liked in that organization. It seemed like their ownership was trying to woo him with a contract that was higher than anything they've ever offered to a head coach in the past. Tocchet is not a young guy, but he's not an old guy. 61, I believe. I'm not anti-Tocchet being the coach of the Philadelphia Flyers. In fact, it might end up proving to be the kind of guy that you need to be behind the bench for the Flyers. But I find it at least slightly concerning that there has been nothing reported by any of the people who are plugged into the organization or from any of the people who consistently covered the team on a beat writer basis. No one right now seems to have a real read on what the Flyers are doing at head coach. Tocchet right now is the name that has been floated many times, and a big part of why Tocchet to the Flyers was thought to be a very good chance of happening is because he's very good friends with Keith Jones. There, of course, was the press conference that Vancouver did a couple of weeks ago where they said, while they were negotiating with Tocchet, you can make him an offer, but it's kind of hard to get him to say yes when his mind is somewhere else, and a lot of people took that to mean the Flyers. But there was an added element of, oh, that's interesting, and that, of course, is that Pittsburgh fired Mike Sullivan, and Tocchet could maybe consider going to coach, although it is at the end of their respective careers, going to coach Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin. The Rangers' job is a really attractive one for any potential head coach. That is the most Stanley Cup-ready team. You have an incredible netminder in Shesterkin. You have a number of younger guys and veteran players that are very, very good. That is a team that many thought was going to go on a potential cup run this year. You could pretty much go into that job, and yes, there were some toxicity issues, and yes, there is a legitimate question to be had of why Drury survived, why ownership didn't get rid of the GM in addition to the head coach, why Lavi ended up seeming to be the fall guy. But that Rangers job is probably the most attractive one. The Pittsburgh job is attractive. The Flyers job, in fairness, mostly because of Matvei Mishkov, or at least a large part of it due to Matvei Mishkov, is an attractive job. The Ducks job, I don't think is that enticing of an opening. The Kraken job, don't know if that's really that enticing. If Tocchet wants to stay out west, all right, Seattle's job maybe is a little bit interesting. But here's the problem. There are people who want David Carl to be the coach of this team, right? Guy's had a lot of success at the national level, had a lot of success with Denver as a college coach. And there are people who want to throw all the money in the world at David Carl, and they will not be happy unless David Carl is the coach of the Flyers. And I think that there is a 0.00000% chance of David Carl coming to Philadelphia. I don't see it. everything that I have heard around people who are at least relatively familiar with the guy or have followed this guy through his coaching career, the Flyers' job just does not seem to be the kind of thing that he would want to uproot his life for, uproot a family for, to come out east where you have no guarantee of a long-term commitment from a team. I just don't see it. If I'm David Carl and I want to take a job in the NHL, it's in New York. Like, why would you, just in fairness, why would you want to take over a rebuilding Flyers team or a rebuilding Ducks team or a pretty good team in Seattle or take over an aging or very aged at this point Pittsburgh team when that Rangers job is available? And by the way, David Carl doesn't have to leave his current role. And there will be teams next year or even throughout this regular season as they're lobbing off the heads of coaches in the NHL. There are going to be other openings that are going to come available. And if you are David Carl, why would you leave a comfortable existence simply for the money and no real long-term guarantee? Why would you do that? Why would you come to Philadelphia for that? I don't think it's going to happen. It really very much feels like Tocchet's job to lose. If Tocchet were to pick Pittsburgh or pick another team, you would then think that there's a very good chance that Brad Shaw could kind of jump to the top of their list. And you look at bringing Brad Shaw here as the head coach on a short-term deal, kind of a prove-it deal. See if him as a guy who can teach and develop, which is what Danny Briere talked about at the end of the regular season. Shaw is a teacher. He is a guy who listens to the players. He is a guy that the players listen to. He's a guy that there was a very strong juxtaposition of Torts and his style and the way that he would kind of approach guys versus how Shaw did. To me, the smartest thing to do, right? If your coach options right now are Tocchet, David Carl's out, at least in my mind, I don't think he's in. And he's removed himself from the Chicago job, by the way. He took himself out of the running there. So if my options as the Philadelphia Flyers were Tocchet, Brad Shaw, Ferschweiler from Western Michigan, or Mike Sullivan, or another retread, I probably would hand the reins over to the guy that was the interim coach at the end of the year. Now, I historically hate the idea of giving an interim guy the reins to the team. I traditionally don't like it because very often you see the new coach bump, you see the team rally behind that coach, and this happened with Rob Thompson. It has happened with others in the city. They rally behind the interim coach, and you get into the next season, and that message kind of falls flat. Or by the end of their first full season as the coach, the message kind of falls flat. I would still rather give the job to Brad Shaw and reevaluate in a year on a guy that you give a short-term deal to, that you're not breaking the bank for, that understands what it's like to coach in this city and has a good working understanding of how to deal with the current guys on the roster and isn't going to be an active deterrent for potential free agents. I'd rather go that route. Now, I know that my opinion has no impact on how the Flyers approach their head coach search. And I totally get that there are many reasons to believe that Rick Tocchet is going to be the next coach. But he doesn't move the needle for me. And I don't know if he moves the needle for potential free agents this year or next. Now, look, whoever comes into this team next year is going to improve this team. Danny Briere is going to improve this roster. This will likely be a playoff team in the 2025-2026 season. So regardless of who the Flyers end up hiring, it will look like they've done yeoman's work to get this from a draft lottery, number 4 in the draft lottery team, to being a playoff team, regardless of who comes in. Tocchet, Shaw, Ferschweiler, Sullivan, retread, whoever. They're going to look like a really good coach. The question is, if the real goal here is to be the teacher, if the real goal here is to develop, is Tocchet the right guy? I'm not so sure. It doesn't mean he can't be. It just means I need to see a lot more. Now, would Ferschweiler be interesting? As a collegiate coach, yes. As a collegiate coach who's had a lot of success, Yes, as a guy who understands the mentality of the young, modern player, he would be interesting, and he would kind of fit the mold of being somebody who fits that teacher role. The guy that I really am not interested in, and while I'm not like going batshit crazy and like going head over heels for the idea of Tocchet being the head coach, one guy that I'm not interested in at all being the head coach of this team is Mike Sullivan. And I was going to get back to a whole bunch of people on Twitter, and then my kid ended up in the hospital, so forgive me for not firing back, I guess. But like Mike Sullivan doesn't even remotely move the needle. In fact, Mike Sullivan taking over this job, taking over this team, would actively piss me off. Because while there are people who point out the fact that Sullivan has had a lot of success with Pittsburgh, his message eventually kind of fell on deaf ears. And yes, we can look at Pittsburgh the last few years and say that Hextall certainly didn't help things. And they certainly haven't done a very good job of retooling that roster to get the most out of an aging Sidney Crosby and an aging Evgeny Malkin. But I can also look at the fact that Sullivan had a lot of success with that team built on the backs of a much better and younger Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin. We haven't had to see what kind of coach Mike Sullivan can be with a largely underwhelming roster that doesn't have generational talents on it. It doesn't mean that he's not a good coach. And there are people who believe that what Mike Sullivan showed at Four Nations is enough to make you really believe that he is still a great coach. I'm just not positive that that's the guy I'd go after. Oh, by the way, it should go without saying, but Mike Sullivan and John Tortorella are very close. So much so that before Torts got shown the door by the Philadelphia Flyers, there was rampant speculation that perhaps Torts would have moved aside so that Mike Sullivan could have taken over behind the bench and gotten his friend that job. Do you think that given how unceremoniously John Tortorella was kicked out the door, that now his old pal Mike Sullivan is going to say, yeah, you know what, I want to go work for that organization? I'm not so sure. Now, if we look at what Mike Sullivan has been as a head coach, and let me see if I can pull this up without having the computer meltdown, and there are a bunch of ad networks on the site that I'd like to show you here, but if we just take a look at Mike Sullivan's coaching record over the last few years, all right, you have to take a look at what he's been since the 2015-2016 season with Pittsburgh, because that happens to be the first of 2 years that he led the Penguins to a Stanley Cup, 2015-2016. Let me pull this whole thing up here. Get rid of the ad network. All right, here we go. This is Mike Sullivan as the head coach of Pittsburgh. And there are great results, and there are some really strong seasons. Plenty of seasons going 40-plus wins. But you get outside of the 2 Stanley Cups, which, again, great things. Who the hell is going to argue with a Stanley Cup winning coach? Things didn't get significantly better, right? You have some good years, third-place finishes, first-place finish in the division, and then you look at the last 3 years. Sidney Crosby has been aging. Evgeny Malkin has been aging. The results haven't been quite as good. You look at a team that in 2022-2023 was overall under 500. Yes, you could talk about the loser point, but that's still 40-42. You could take a look at the next year. That adds up to 38 and, repeat after me, 44. That's under 500. You can look at the year that just got him fired. 34 and, repeat after me, 48. This is not a guy who, to me, screams winner. This isn't a guy who screams to me player development. This isn't a guy who I would go and back up the Brinks truck for. He's a very good coach, or at least a good coach. But when you have the blessing of coaching Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin, chances are you're going to win a lot of games. So I'm not at a point right now where I can look much beyond those years and look much beyond those 2 players and say that, like, sometimes coaches just happen to benefit from having generational talents on their team.